Hi, and welcome to this event with Biden policy on immigration. Thank you for taking the time to join us. And we are definitely sorry if you have encountered any technical problems with the registration, but this is out of our control. My name is Jabbar Al-Ubaidi. I'm Professor of Media Studies and Communication Technologies at Department of Communication Studies, and also the Academic Director of Global Programs at the Minik Institute for Global Engagement. Our institute is really the hub for most of these policies concerning or related issues, as well as global issues. So welcome to our, this is, I think, the third event. And in the interest of time, I just would like to thank Susan Williams, because really she did so much to make sure, yes, she deserved that. So thank you, Susan. Also, our social media officer, our colleague, Sasha Link, she did a lot of work. And certainly, you know, other people that probably they work behind the scene. This is a teamwork, and this is BSU way. We always, when we, even if someone just sending the information, it's really in the spirit of the team. That's BSU, that's Bridgewater State University. So welcome to this event. And the first speaker will be Dr. Wenkei Tu, as he became the founding assistant provost for global engagement and senior international officer in July 2018. Prior to this, he was professor of history. He created the Asian Studies minor and served as the Minik Institute's academic director. As the SIO, Senior International Officer of the university, he is responsible for overseeing international operations and really involving the academic and non-academic that related to the to our work as international faculty, affiliated faculty, students, staff, and librarians. It's a long, really list, but he is very much involved in study abroad, undergraduate research when he was a professor, and still really. And so he's our guy, he's our colleague, he's our friend that working with all of us at Bridgewater State University and throughout the globe to make sure that we are connected. So we take our BSU to the world and we bring the world to our campus. Dr. Wenkei Tu, please, the floor, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Ubaidi, and welcome all the students, staff, faculty, and any members of the community or in the world for joining us today. Before we start talking about the topic of immigration, I would like to acknowledge indigenous peoples are the stewards, traditional stewards of the land, and the land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land. I mentioned this about our indigenous people owning the land to highlight that the history of immigration is both a history of our nation, of settlement and colonialism. Whether you are here in the last 2 years or in your families have been here in the last 200 years, we are all immigrants and settlers of this land. And obviously, we took over the land from the natives, and we also built up this nation. You know, the cliche is that the US is a land of immigrants, it's a land of opportunity. But there's also another side of it. The US is also a land of exclusion and discrimination. So when we think about history of immigration, we need to think about both sides, whether we're opening up doors to people from all over the world to become a part of the American fabric, or whether we are excluding certain groups of people and using certain criteria that deliberately discriminate and exclude people based on their race, ethnicity, and national origins. So today we're going to follow the tradition of talking about immigration in the context of both global engagement and American studies. This is a topic that connects the United States to the world and the world to the United States, as Dr. Jabal already said. But this is especially timely because we just had a new administration with President Biden. And on the first day, he already issued several executive orders to change the policy of former President Trump. If you remember that, we'll go into some of the details of these policies, like reversing the travel ban against Muslim and majority Muslim nations and a lot of African countries, stop the construction of the border wall, unless, of course, the former president that the Mexicans should pay for it. And, we'll talk about that. And also on the first day, he reversed some of the policies of the former administration, and by promising an immigration reforms and new policies. So that's the so-called U.S. Citizens Act. We'll talk about this in a moment. The other three speakers will talk a little bit more about that. This is the tradition of focusing on a series of topics about immigration. So I thank Dr. Gostchev's class for attending this session. This year, we have faculty and staff who have done research on immigration and migration to have a roundtable discussion about the new administration and the new bill that is being put together to the Congress. Now, there's nothing more timely than talking about a topic that just came out, 2 days ago or 3 days ago. Last week, basically last Thursday, the bill was sent to the House of Representatives. And Monday, 2 days ago, the bill was sent to the Senate. So it doesn't mean that the bill will be taken up by the Congress immediately, and I'm sure that Dr. Navari will talk more about that. So I would really like to focus on the issues of why do I talk about international education, and just give a few highlights about that or issues about that. When we think about immigration, we're talking about people of immigrant and non-immigrant status who gradually become immigrants. And the term immigration could be defined by people who are trying to become American citizens or permanent residents through a process of immigration and naturalization. And this is a long and painful process for many people who try to come here through employment or family connections or marriage, or to flee from political persecution, and so on. So there's always the distinction between voluntary migration and involuntary migration. So we have immigration through the official channels. We also have people who are forced to come here, who are in limbo in their process. When they came over here, they might have overstayed their visa status, and they become active in the informal sector of the economy. They continue to pay taxes and contribute to our economy. And some people came here as children, and they become so-called DACA, what we call the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. People who were younger children, when they came here, it was not their fault to come here. And then there are also international students. That's the group I'm concerned with, and international workers who gradually apply to become permanent residents and American citizens. So in the Trump administration, there was a lot of constraints on visas, because we look at immigration as a long process from people who get their visas, either as students, workers, tourists, visitors, temporary workers, to a period of settlement and stay. And a lot of times, we need to look at people who don't have immigration status to become immigrants, and not just those who are applying for immigration. If we close our door and say that only people who can apply for immigration are considered topics of immigration, then we don't really think about how people become immigrants, because people do become immigrants because of many different reasons. Sometimes they make up their decision only after 10 years or 20 years after they're here. And sometimes it takes 10 or 20 years to become an immigrant. So these things are very important for us to think about. So there are different types of visas that international students and visitors get. If they're travelers, they just get a traveler visa. But if they're immigrant, they're students, they get, their student visas. The student visas is a process for them to study in a university like Bridgewater or any other university or schools. But after they graduate, if they find a job, if their skills valuable to our economy, they have all the rights to apply for permanent residency and then become citizenship. And this is the process that my office is helping the students, mostly for getting their visas to come to study in the United States. In the Trump administration, there was a lot of restriction against students by questioning their duration of stay. They really put a lot of restrictions on how many years they can stay to study. So they had a rule that say some students can only stay for 2 years, even though their degrees are 4 years. Or some schools can only issue 4 years, and even though the degrees take more than 4 years. So that's one of the rules that need to be changed. And the second one is that because of COVID-19, there's a lot of restriction against students taking online classes. As we all know at BSU, we really need to have hybrid or online classes to accommodate the students in this transitional period. In the past, the government didn't allow students to take online classes, international students to take online classes. So there were still restrictions against coming into the country if they take online classes. But I do think that, they need the flexibility when they come over here. And, because of different schools have different regulations. So this needs to be changed as well. And sometimes in the port of entry, the immigration officials would stop the students from coming here even though they have a documentation that they're doing a hybrid program. And they still question that, because how can international students to do 100% in person when we're still in the middle of the pandemic? So these are some of the issues that are very troubling. And then there's the issue of optional practical training program, which is for students who, after they graduate, if they are in a STEM field, science field, engineering and computer science, in the past, they have 3 years to have a kind of a practical training program. But then Trump administration wanted to limit it to 1 year, or try to eliminate some of those optional practical training program. So in the new administration, there's this emphasis of preserving and restoring the optional practical training program, and also allow F1 and J1 students, the regular international students, to be easier to get their working visas, which is called H-1B visas. The backlog and bureaucracy of getting your working visa is really hard for all the international employees, whether they want to work at BSU or whether they want to work at any, jobs for any jobs in the United States. So for countries like China and India, sometimes it would take 5 to 10 years to get a green card. So all these reforms are trying to make it easier, not more difficult, for students to really be able to try to contribute to the United States workforce. Remember that international students last year contributed about $40 billion to the US economy. And they actually very important part of the economy. And most of the immigrants contributed to this country, especially some of the larger corporations, the owners are all coming from first generation immigrants and first generation Americans like myself. In BSU, 1 out of 6 or 7 professors are born outside the United States, like myself, including 2 of us on this panel. So I think it's very important for us to think about the importance of the immigration workforce and what they bring to the country. I think we can talk more about international education, but it's basically, I will focus on, it's important for us to think about, what does it mean to have a more welcoming environment and policy for international students, scholars, and families and employees. Sometimes the students or the spouses, they cannot get work authorization if they are students' families. So there's also this effort to try to change the law as well. So all these issues are mostly for international students and workers, and especially how you get an H-1B visas and then try to extend your stay, eventually trying to apply for a green card. Now, the other faculty members are going to talk about DACA and other areas. You have dreamers, you have students who were born here, or who were not born here, who came here when they were very young. They went to schools here, they spent all their lives here, but they're not able to get financial aid to come to the university. Sometimes they're not able to really be open about that. So there's this idea of following President Obama to continue to support DACA and actually try to have a path to citizenship. And finally, so I think for higher education, we really focus on having a more diverse group of immigrant and international students. And that's why we're trying to support immigration reforms in our country. So to wrap up, in the bill itself would have include more information. I don't mean that I wanted to have a caveat. This is not just an issue about President Trump's administration. This is a long history of debate in the United States about immigration. And some people really wanted to scapegoat immigrants and exclude immigrants, whether they are Democratic administration or Republican administration in history. So the last major meaningful reform was in 1965. And it's been more than almost 60 years. Right. So without further ado, so I think I won't go beyond my time, and I'll turn this to the second speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Kaito, for establishing the foundation for the immigration issue, which is very important, especially when it's pertaining to students, faculty, staff, librarians that they came from other lands. At this point, I would like to introduce our second speakers. And I just want to make sure that how proud I am as a colleague to have all the speakers from Bridgewater State University. We are really a force, to be honest with you. Sometimes we undermine that, or we don't think about it and put it in perspective. So thank you. Dr. Rachel Nefari, she is, of course, a professor in the political science department at Bridgewater State University. She earned her PhD from University at Texas in Austin. And government, our hearts and prayers go to our people in Texas because of the weather and what they have been dealing with. Her research really focuses on the most of the issues related to framing and issues of definition, immigration policy and politics, regional governance, populism, and content analysis. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Politics and the Journal of Experimental Political Science. She recently co-authored Immigration in the 21st Century. We'll hope she will share the title and also the link for that book, so you can buy it if you wish. With volume, The Future of U.S. Empire in the Americans. My friend, Dr. Nveri, the floor is yours. And you can also share your PowerPoint because you have the permission for that. Thank you so much. You have 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes.
All right, well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And yes, I've been keeping up with Texas and everyone I know in Texas, and it has been a rather rough week for them. But as Dr. Jabbar said, I do have a PowerPoint for you, so let me put that up. Because I am going to be talking about public opinion. And I figured with public opinion, it is probably best to give you some graphs to look at instead of just me saying numbers towards you. So most of the data I'm going to use is going to come from Pew. Their 2019 survey. This one is a 2020 survey. So overall, so what does America think about immigrants? Obviously, immigration policy has been front page news. It's been very, very salient throughout the Trump administration. And of course, in response to a lot of the Trump administrations and the Biden administration as well. But overall, what do Americans think about immigrants? Well, this is from, this was conducted June 4th to 10th in 2020. And what we find is that 3/4 of Americans say undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay in the US legally. And this if certain conditions are met. Now, what's interesting here is majorities in both coalitions and both Democrats and Republicans do support this, but Democrats are much more likely to support this. I don't think that's going to shock anyone. These views are actually little changed since August 2019. And when I went and looked back at the previous surveys, this was actually, it's been pretty high, allowing unauthorized migrants a way to stay in the United States since about 2014. The lowest it ever dropped was 68%, saying that there should be a way to allow them to stay. Now, I thought this might actually have been higher when you looked at DACA and you looked at people, dreamers, but actually it's pretty close. So when you say if you were brought to the United States as a child, do you think there should be a way for you to stay or not? It breaks down pretty much within the margin of error. So we're getting pretty similar results for this. Now, I want to back up a little bit and just kind of, before we talk a little bit more about people's views on policy, talk about positive view or views of immigrants as a whole. We often hear, America is the country of immigrants, all of these things. So how do we feel about immigrants? Well, most say openness to people from around the world is essential to US identity. 2/3 of Americans say that openness to people from all over the world is essential to who America is as a nation, while 32% say that it is too open. And then by 57 to 41%, more Americans say that the growing number of newcomers from other countries strengthen American society rather than threaten our values or society. Okay, and you can see, so this is actually broken down on the screen, not just by the total, but also by ethnicity, age, education, as well as partisanship. Okay, so there is a definite difference in the partisanship, and this graph kind of breaks that out for you. So you can see the number, the yellow brownish one is all, whereas we can see the percent of newcomers strengthen American society, while Democrats have tended to be more pro this question, we do see an increase in the number of Republicans over the Trump administration, saying that newcomers strengthen American society. And here you can see the overall, though, the number of people that say newcomers from other countries threaten American customs and values has gone down over time. And this is, of course, so this isn't a great 100% great comparison over time, because they did change the way the surveys are done. You can kind of see how they break that out in here. But we can see this total, that it's Republican, lean Republican, and Democrat, lean Democrat. All right, so we started off, though, this saying, so most people think immigrants are good, they're a net positive for US society, there should be some way for unauthorized migrants to stay in the United States. But let's dig down a little bit more into some of these policies. Now, this survey, the numbers I'm going to show you now are from September 2019. So in the middle, right in the depths of the Trump administration, when we're starting to think about the primaries, this question asks people, what do you think is a goal for immigration policy? So they were given the option of saying it was very important, somewhat important, not too important, and not at all important. And people were given 4 policy issues. We have increased security along the US-Mexico border, establish a way for immigrants here illegally to stay legally, take in refugees escaping from war and violence, and increase deportations of those in the US illegally. Now we see sizable majorities saying that it is important to increase security. That's either very or somewhat. Same with establish a way for immigrants to stay here legally, and taking in refugees. The amount of people saying that increasing deportations, that drops a little bit, but it's still in about the 50% area. Okay. Now, as you might expect, views of immigration policy goals are once again sharply divided by partisan lines. Republicans and independents who lean towards the Republican Party are much more likely than Democrat and Democrat leaners to emphasize the importance of securing the border. Meanwhile, more Democrats than Republicans view providing a pathway to legal status an important, a very important or somewhat important goal. And you can see this one kind of breaks down this by party. So this one's going to look at all of these 4 policies divided by parties. And what it also does, which is kind of nice, is it gives you, so they ask you, what party do you identify as a member of any of these parties? And then it asks you on a 1 to 7 scale, with 1 being very liberal, 7 being very conservative, where would you place yourself ideologically? So we can see if you call yourself a Republican and you say you are a conservative and Republican, you are very, very you think that increasing the security along the US-Mexico border is extremely important. That's 81%. Whereas people that would put themselves in the more moderate liberal Republican camp, only 52% of them think it's very important. And then, of course, these numbers are basically reversed when you come to the Democrat side. So I will post this too in the, I'll post a link to the Pew survey, or actually I'll post this in the Google Docs so you can see these yourself if you want to come back to them. And I do have the link down here. Okay, but let's talk about one of the things. So now most of these policy issues are indeed addressed in the Biden bill. We see there is policies of increasing security along the US-Mexico border, not with a border wall, but with more survey and electronic surveillance, which does have its issues. You can see the 2007 border wall issue with that. They want to, the increased deportations is not going to happen under the Biden bill. Biden has been looking at ways to decrease deportations and focus deportations once again on unauthorized migrants who have criminal records or security threats. Obviously, the Biden bill provides a pathway to citizenship and also restarts our refugee procedures. Basically, the Trump administration has ended the refugee and asylum admission to the United States through various administrative means. So any admission of refugee or asylum seekers is going to increase what it was over the Biden years. Now, the thing, like I said, is those numbers saying that there should be some way for people to become citizens or stay in the United States have remained high since 2014. Why haven't we seen any action? Most Americans like immigration over time. Most Americans say immigration should be increased. We have seen increasing, and this number has just gotten even stronger over the Trump support. So why am I not optimistic about the chances of this bill passing? Well, one is, what do these questions mean to people? What does being allowed to stay mean? Does it mean a work authorization? Does it mean deportation relief? Well, you can stay, but we're not going to deport you. We're not going to give you work authorization or anything.
5 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so does it mean you get a pathway to citizenship? So these are also, what do these things mean to people? That question in Pew of should we give asylum to people fleeing from violent situations? Well, most people say yes, but when we say violent situations, do people think that the situation in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Central America, are they thinking of that as a violent situation that requires refugee admission? So there's a lot of differences going on there. So even though most Americans are pro-immigrant, that can mean very different things to each individual citizen. Number two is partisanship. Partisanship has gone up over the years. There's a lot of research on this, and we tend to be only about 17% of Americans are ideologically committed to any one, political ideology. Typically, Americans are very ideologically inconsistent, and we kind of treat our partisan politics as a team sport. So this creates things where, well, I'm a Republican, so therefore I am for border security and not for a pathway for citizenship. I'm a Democrat, I'm for a pathway to citizenship. I'm not for a border wall. But this also has other effects. There has been some idea that some Republicans have left the Republican Party, viewing it as Trump. So there may be more former Republicans identifying as independents. But this creates a bigger problem for the Republican Party because the people that don't want immigration expansion or the Biden bill or a pathway to citizenship are Republican, are partisan, ideologically committed Republicans who are the most active people in the Republican Party. They are the ones doing the grassroots activism. They are the ones voting in primaries. And the Republican Party particularly has a fear of being primaried from the right. This goes back to when Cantor, who was the Speaker of the House, he was the second in line, got primaried by a virtual nobody, Dave Brat, and lost his seat because of Cantor's support for the Gang of Eight immigration bill. So we have a small group that's very committed that this issue matters a lot to them, and they vote in Republican primaries, making Republicans less likely to support this bill. So my last point, and this is where I will end, is the issue of issue salience. So while a lot of people might support this, though, aside from that small group that's really committed, there's an even smaller group that is committed to expanding these bills, and that this is the number one issue for them. For most other people, immigration is important, but it's not the issue. So they'd be willing to vote for a candidate whose views from them differ on immigration because immigration isn't that important to them. Now, this other one we don't have data for, but there's also the chance that people were saying that they were pro-immigrant. This pro-immigrant feeling is actually more of an anti-Trump feeling. It was a way to signify that you are against Donald Trump. So it wasn't so much that you're pro-immigrant or pro-immigrant expansion, but that you're anti-Trump. So So now that Trump is out of the White House, it's not clear how this dynamic is going to play out. So that is a brief overview of public opinion on immigration in the United States and why, even though immigration public opinion seems very positive towards this bill, I would not bet money that it will pass.
Thank you, Dr. Navarro, for this very important politics behind immigration historically and also currently. So I think our audience will enjoy asking some questions about that. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Fed Kostajev, is an assistant professor of criminal justice. So this is another angle for the immigration. At the Bridgewater State University, Fed's current research focuses on immigration, ethno-racial diversity, crime, and justice in the United States. His work has appeared in the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology, the Sociological Quarterly, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. He also co-authored several book chapters. Dr. Fed Kostajev, welcome to this event, and the floor is yours, sir. You have up to 15 minutes.
Well, it's going to be tough to follow up a presentation that says the bill might not pass. So we probably should have put Dr. Navarro at the end. But maybe I'll cheer you guys up a little bit. So a couple things to note. So I'm, again, so my presentation is going to closely follow Doug Massey, who's been one of the top scholars. He's a sociologist at Princeton, one of the top scholars of migration across U.S.-Mexico border. And so there's a link in the chat. I put the Doug Massey's article that I'm going to use extensively here for you to read, because it really sort of makes the great case for and gives you more detail on some of the things I'm going to be talking about here, and just kind of to reflect on how this kind of brings things a little bit full circle for me, because this Doug Massey article is actually based on a presentation that I attended at the last conference before the world collapsed with the COVID pandemic, which was a year ago last week in Philadelphia, Eastern Sociological Society conference. And that's where he presented that study. And so today I'm going to draw largely on it. At this point, it's been published. So a copy of the article is in the Google Drive folder in the chat. All right, it looks like I'm sharing my screen. Somebody yell at me if you don't see me sharing the screen. Good, okay. All right, again, the bill, the Biden immigration bill, which is formally known as U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. We just were able to acquire recently the full copy of it, which is 300 some pages, which I look forward to reading at some point, but a much shorter sort of explanation of the bill. There's another link in the chat that takes you to the White House fact sheet that gives you like a short summary that was created sort of for the public. And instead of addressing the bill in its entirety, I wanted to focus on one very sort of specific but very important portion of the bill, which is the attempt with this bill to address the underlying causes of migration, and sort of addressing the causes of things that can lead to, link with social problems, really resonates with me as somebody who studies migration from a scientific standpoint. And sort of scientific study of migration is all about studying its causes, consequences. And so I very much, and this is going to be in my concluding remarks, think that addressing the causes is the smart policy, because enforcement, which is the other option of when we just, essentially terrorize and coerce people who enact things, it's not as an effective policy long-term as addressing the actual causes of migration. So the bill specifically speaks about providing $4 billion in aid to the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras as a way to ameliorate the conditions that resulted in refugee flow from these countries. And at the same time, those who have already arrived at the southern border and are seeking asylum in U.S. to speed up their asylum and expand the asylum program. So take in those who already escaped those countries and then provide funds to those countries to try to stop the causes of migration. But again, I think it's useful for us to think when we craft immigration policy about causes of migration in general, not just for the Northern Triangle, but for any immigrants and any sort of characteristic that immigration takes on in the United States. So let's look at the causes of migration for why people have been crossing U.S. Southern border, which is, let's leave no pretenses. When people talk about securing the border or border security, that's the border we typically are talking about, ignoring the fact that there's also border with Canada, and technically every single airport, seaport, train station that's connected to other countries is also border. But when we talk about securing the border, it's usually Mexican border. So what about the causes of migration across Mexican border? The United States, for nearly a century, has been addicted, and this is a direct quote, unfortunately I don't remember by who, addicted to Mexican labor, especially to source its needs in agriculture. Again, American agriculture could not run without the help of Mexican labor. And this has been a long-standing cyclical migration and valued by American legislators specifically because when the labor is not needed in the off season, or when the labor need is drying up, proximity of Mexico allows people to go back. Another notion I would like to dispel through this presentation is that everybody who comes to America wants to stay. It is absolutely not true if we look at historical records. Somebody who comes to America in their 40s and 50s, you very much, has links with the country of origin and wants to go back a lot of times. So the idea that everybody who tries to get in here tries to stay is, contrary to actual evidence. And so this system has existed for almost 100 years, where the labor needs was sourced through labor from Mexico. Even when the United States in 1920s, the last time we were at the height of the anti-immigrant sentiment, which was merely directed at Asian and Eastern European immigrants. And in 1920s, US essentially shut its borders to European and Asian migration. It deliberately did not touch the Mexican migration. It simply was not even mentioned in the bill. Mexican workers coming to America to work were not counted, were not supervised in any way, although there was Border Patrol established in 1920s. The thing went on as business as usual. So Mexican migration completely escaped the quotas or shutting down of any kind of borders, and allowed to continue because of specific pressure in the legislator to ignore Mexican, not even consider them as migrants. This changed in 1960s, where in 1960s, because of the sort of revision of federal policy during the civil rights era, as was mentioned, 1965 was the last overhaul of the immigration system. The temporary, so the worker programs that allowed Mexicans to come in were abolished. And so, but on the grounds, facts did not change. This flow simply continued as undocumented flow. But this was not people going through the desert risking their lives. Most of the people just continued going to the same farms, same plantations that they worked for before. And Border Patrol, even if they caught them, would simply drive people to the border, and then people would try again. And this system worked for everybody because, again, public was not overly concerned with illegal immigration across the Mexico border. Mexican workers were able to come in, earn money, and invest money back in their communities in Mexico when they go back in the off season. And Border Patrol, which was fairly inefficient and corrupt, got to show that they're doing something by, at least being there at the border. But nobody really cared all the way in the 1980s about what's going on at the border. In 1980s, for a variety of economic and other sort of changes, the illegal immigration becomes constructed as a social problem in America. Again, nobody really cared all the way through the 70s into 80s about illegal immigration, but all of a sudden becomes an urgent need. This is where our call to secure the border is born as a phenomena in the media. And it leads to a major militarization of some sectors of the border to stem this flow of Mexican labor that's been coming, again, for a century, something that's been done by fathers, grandfathers, and et cetera, with nearly cultural expectations that this would be done. Unfortunately, this policy completely backfires. And as you can see here, 1980s and 90s is when we put, really military style enforcement on the border. And instead of driving down undocumented immigration, it in fact skyrockets undocumented immigration, because the logical decision for the Mexican labor that cycles through US-Mexico border is it becomes too dangerous and too expensive to cross the US-Mexico border. And the logical decision is to stick around in the United States. And so this is one of the greatest backfires in American policy, where we intended to reduce illegal immigration, and we did exactly the opposite, bringing us to some 11 million undocumented population settled in the United States because it's too dangerous to go back and forth now. But this changes as well. As you can see, the dashed line shows you the Mexican undocumented population, which reaches its peak in around 2008, when the economy in the United States collapses and starts to decrease. And if any of you think that this is because United States border enforcement finally succeeded, it is not. What has happened is Mexico, we in America tend to think of Mexico as, underdeveloped, borderline dangerous, disorganized country, but it's completely incorrect. This is a picture of Mexico City. Mexico today as a country, especially in its urban centers, is very much catching up in terms of its level of development to first world countries. And the reason the migration from Mexico stops and starts to revert, so today we're actually losing more undocumented Mexicans because they voluntarily are going back, because the economy in Mexico does no longer have spare labor to send out to the United States. Their fertility rates in cities is now below replacement level. So they're simply not going to have the children who will repeat the difficult journey of their fathers to United States to work in the factory or in the fields. This migration has largely been replaced by a very different types of migration, which is from the Northern Triangle. The Northern Triangle refers to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Conditions there are absolute dire. Their homicide rates are nearly 2 to 3 times as high as nations located right next to them, such as Costa Rica and Panama. If you have seen the Watchmen miniseries on HBO, where police officers have to wear masks to protect their personal identity against retaliation, this is the reality in the Northern Triangle. Law enforcement has to wear masks to protect themselves and their family from retaliation from violent gangs. And so this migration is not for labor. This is a humanitarian crisis where, as you can see, we're now, since 2008, no longer really apprehending Mexican nationals who are single males trying to get into the United States like their fathers and grandfathers did to work in the fields. We see skyrocketing migration from the Northern Triangle. And this type of migration is trying to go and get asylum in the United States. And to claim asylum, they literally have to surrender themselves at the port of entry to the Border Patrol agents. This is why you have the skyrocket. Again, these people are not trying to sneak into the United States, which is still possible even with all the resources we have. These people are here for humanitarian reasons. I borrowed the slide directly from Doug Massey's presentation that I referenced. So this gives you the picture. Again, it is not a single Mexican male, which is what we saw for 100 years, come and work in the fields. It's family units, children sometimes by themselves that need help. And unfortunately, the data clearly suggests that we also have a moral responsibility for this asylum seeking flow from Central America, because as this
3
chart
minutes.
shows, the US intervention in during the Cold War, late years of Cold War in 1980s, is directly responsible for downfall of the GDPs of the Northern Triangle countries. And this top line shows you the non-frontier nations, which are located right next to them: Belize, Costa Rica, and Panama, all of which are doing quite well. But we did not mess with those nations' politics. We very much messed with Guatemala, El Salvador, and other nations. So it is our moral responsibility as a country to address this type of migration flow. And so my concluding remark is perhaps what we're seeing in terms of using enforcement instead of this more targeted policy that addresses immigration causes is not new. Unfortunately, this has been happening all over the American government. Jonathan Simon wrote a famous criminological work saying that American governance in 1960s shifted from the New Deal governance, where we used big government resources and big thinking programs to eliminate causes of social problems, to essentially militarized style enforcement we see in criminal justice has now been spilled into all kinds of other institutions, including our immigration. And we've been trying to drive down immigration through enforcement. And with Trump administration, this has kind of culminated in some really tragic incidents like separation of children from their parents at the border, and sort of really horrendous actions in the name of enforcement of the law. But all of this is misguided. We very much need to address the causes of migration. And if you're concerned about overpopulation, once again, in the current transnational world, most people, once they settle, are probably not most people, many people aren't going to want to stay in the United States. In fact, if the bill passes and we provide a way to regularize some 10 million undocumented immigrants we have in the United States, we'll probably see some people actually leaving the United States. One of the things is undocumented immigrants can't travel because it's too dangerous to cross the border, because you might not be able to come back. So if we regularize them, we actually might lose population because people will get their green cards, citizenships, and go to other countries. Even Americans, fun fact, 3 million Americans do not live in America. They are all over the world. So we send Americans out to other countries as well. Finally, what do we mean by stay in the United States? You know, if you take my family as an example, and I'm an American citizen and I spend a good amount of time in the United States, but I also have a Ukrainian citizenship and I have property in Russia. So you tell me, where do I stay? You know, so the idea is, if we regularize this flow, if we help the Central America, we can establish a system where sort of people don't necessarily stay in America. Many will choose to go back once things stabilize. And finally, if you're worried about the costs, coming back to the first slide, Biden administration is going to spend $4 billion in funds. Immigrants, when they come to America, send remittances, which is money back to the family and friends from where they're from. The total amount of remittances for just the country of El Salvador in 2017 was $4.6 billion. So the amount of money that's spent back is actually comparable to what we're going to spend in aid. And this is the final remark. Again, I'll post these slides in the folder, but this is again from the Doug Massey conclusion is, we've already done this before. We've taken in after United States lost the Vietnam War, we've taken in some 1.3 million refugees from Southeast Asian countries. There is no reason we cannot do the same with the Northern Triangle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fatkochev, for very important, to me, it's very sad story too. At this point, I would like to introduce our last but not least speaker, Dr. Naveed Fauzi, who came from Iran. Is next to the country that I came from, that's Iraq. So don't confuse Iraq and Iran, you know. So these two countries are almost in war since 1980, really. But now they are in a better situation. Dr. Nafeed Fauzi is an assistant professor of anthropology at Bridgewater State University. His research explores minorities, migration, and emergent forms of pluralism and nationalism in Iran and its diasporas. Fauzi has conducted fieldwork research with and published on religious minorities in Iran, including his book on Zoroastrians and several articles on Kurdish minorities and contemporary Iranian politics. Dr. Fauzi has also conducted fieldwork research in Malaysia and Turkey during the 2014-2017 and is currently working on related publications. And he is actually initiated a new minor that we are working on together to have migration studies on Bridgewater State University. Dr. Fauzi, the floor is yours. You have up to 10 minutes.
Not 15 minutes, Professor Al-Obaidi? All right, then. So I cut my my talk from 1 hour to 15 minutes. I have to improvise and cut 5 more minutes. Thank you for your generous introduction, Professor Al-Obaidi, and thank you for introducing the minor we are working on. The minor is called minor in international migration studies, and we don't make any promises, but we encourage students to take more classes in migration so we can establish to the administration that there is an interest and the minor will actually work. But thank you to my colleagues. I hopefully draw on some of the issues that you highlighted, but my talk is going to focus on the repeal of the so-called Muslim ban, the executive order of President Trump, the first week of the administration. And I divided my talk to 2 parts. The first part, quickly, I will look at the language and the rationale behind the repeal of Biden administration of the Muslim ban. The second part, which is more extensive, I am going to talk about the language and justification of the Muslim ban. And the third part, I am going to introduce some of my own findings and my fieldwork research data throughout the talk. So first, on the repeal, which is called Proclamation on Ending Discriminatory Bans on Entry to the United States. The document is available in the Dropbox that Professor Goshev has provided. If you are interested, it's a short document. So what does this document do? What does this repeal do? First of all, it revokes specifically the executive order number 13780 and 3 proclamations succeeding that executive order. It orders the administration to resume visa processing and clearing the backlog of cases in waiver processing. It orders review of information sharing with our partners and other countries, which is extremely important. And also the introductory part of the document that rationalizes the repeal of the previous executive order, and of course emphasizes religious freedom, tolerance, and also stresses that we already have a rigorous and thorough screening process, whoever comes to the US. But the last 2 rationale are interesting, arguing that the previous executive order jeopardized our global network of alliances and partnerships. And the last one, which is extremely important because it is at the heart of the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban, is that it undermined our national security. While the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban executive order, is entirely based on protecting our national security. Now let's move on to the ban itself. the title of this executive order is Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. And most of the data that I am going to share with you comes from the other document that I have shared in the Dropbox entitled Extreme Vetting. And don't look at the length of the document, it's 50 pages, but 25 pages of the document are the citations and bibliography. So it's a relatively short document. So as I mentioned, 1 week after taking the office, President Trump issued Executive Order number 13769. It was the initial ban. And the most important part of it is that it stopped entry from 7 Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. It was enjoined by federal courts around the country as discriminatory, until the Supreme Court allowed a limited portion of it to go forward. Then the administration revised it. The Executive Order 13780 was issued. That is banned now. And what did it do? It basically added North Korea and Venezuela to the list, removed Sudan and Iraq, and subjected the Sudanese and Iraqis to extreme vetting as opposed to complete exclusion. And it cited national security as the most important reason behind this ban. But we know that President Trump, one of the most important campaign promises that he made over and again was based on this idea that I am quoting now. During the 2015 campaign, he said that I'm calling on a total ban, total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And that campaign pledge remained online until May 2017. The Muslim ban and extreme vetting, therefore, are ways of fulfilling this promise. The idea of national security was added as a way to justify that campaign pledge. I have to cut a little bit here and move on to the next part. There are multiple federal courts who were convinced that the administration argument is baseless. For example, a federal appellate court pointed out there is no finding that present vetting standards are inadequate, our current existing vetting standards are adequate, and no finding that absent the improved vetting procedures, there likely will be harm to our national interest. This is just one example. There are many, many other examples and rulings around the country that the national security argument doesn't make any sense. Despite all this, the Executive Order 13780 states, I'm quoting, since 2001, hundreds of persons born abroad have been convicted of terrorism-related crimes in the United States. Absolutely wrong. The process for screening that the Biden administration says is already rigorous, and I'm going to share my screen now so you also see you have it. So what is this, the existing rigorous process that every applicant has to go through? The first part is that they have to do a form DC-160 visa application form. There are lots of information, biographical information, in addition to 10 fingerprints and photographs. Everybody has to do that, right? And then the information is used and then they have to prove that they are not coming here to stay in the US. So they have to prove that they have properties in their countries, they have incentives to go back, and so on and so forth. So the assumption is that they are going to stay, and they have to prove a negative, right? Then all the data is run against several national security and criminal record databases. If you go to the extreme vetting, all name of all these security and criminal databases are mentioned. And finally, actually not finally, but the next step is that there is an interview with a consular officer who will probe applicant's story. And this is important because this could be considered one of the most rigorous interviews. When I was in Turkey, I was interviewing many Christians, Muslims who converted to Christianity and escaping Iran. And there was a lady who was very active, and we scheduled an interview for my research after her interview with the United States consular officer. And when we were doing the interview, she said that I wish I knew that your interview is going to be so comprehensive, because I would have done this interview first. I did, so she is telling me, I did interview with the Turkish police, and I did interview with the UNHCR, United Nations headquarters, refugee committee, and several other interviews. None of them were as comprehensive as this interview with the American officer. She was the only one that figured out that my baptism paperwork was based on somebody else's, and they had forgotten to update it. This is before the Trump administration, right? And but she said that she was so kind enough, and she realized that the problem was the misunderstanding of, or they had forgotten to update the address, asked me just to contact your church and tell them that you want to update the data. So the rigorous process existed before the Trump administration. And then finally, you have the ruling of the officer, which you cannot challenge. And if visa is denied, it's not subject to judicial review. This is the existing rigorous process that
4 minutes.
How many?
4.
4 minutes, thank you. This was the existing procedure that Biden administration uses to say that, well, we don't need extreme vetting. Now, how did the Muslim ban, so-called Muslim ban, identify applications that require extreme vettings? One of the ways to do that, they said that if countries do not cooperate with us, we don't accept their citizens to come here. There are so many issues and problems with this logic that let's take a look at some of them. First of all, if a country doesn't have good relationship with the US, it doesn't mean that their citizens are going to harm us, right? Second of all, among the 7 Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries that they are citing, only Yemen and Syria do not have biometric passports. Others, including Iran, they do. And the criteria are so selective that, for example, it excludes China, India, and Indonesia, who do not cooperate with Interpol and other international organizations, and they do not report if a passport is stolen or anything like that. So it's selectively applied only to Muslim countries based on religion and based on nationalities. And they are also subject to social media checks. For example, if somebody has been to a terrorist region, it is required, according to the Muslim ban, to go through this extreme vetting. Again, another case. I interviewed a pastor who was persecuted for 10 years in Iran. The information was all over, including covered internationally. And he was from Islamic background, was converted to Christianity, and he was so active that had traveled to Afghanistan several times to teach Christianity, to have classes, to proselytize, and so on and so forth. Even before the Trump administration, his background was checked, and he kind of went through extreme vetting. The next step is pretty much banning him from coming to the US. While he was applying to become a refugee, he was an asylum seeker because of the persecution that he had endured in Iran. I'm moving on to the last part. There are economic and cultural costs associated with this ban. As my colleagues, all of them discussed, migrants contribute tremendously to the economy of this country. BSU has relationship with one of these centers that works with migrants, the Hope Community Center in Apopka, Florida. Hopefully on March 18, I am inviting two of the staff members to come and introduce the organization to our campus. We send students there. Hopefully after the pandemic, we will do that. The contribution to our agriculture, to the contribution to our culture is tremendous. I'm not going to go through the numbers here, but you're more than welcome to look at them in the document that I have posted. And cost to our cultural value is enormous. It's a way at our national character for the sake of speculative national security benefits. It undermines American values by conveying to the world that the United States is no longer committed to openness and non-discrimination. And when we look at as Professor Gosyev also talked about, when we look at the history of immigration in the US, we see there is a trend. After the Second World Congress officially removed race-based restrictions on immigration. Beginning the civil rights era, Congress began to eliminate national origin as criterion for admission. In 1965, as Professor Venkai To discussed, it eliminated the quota system and replaced it with a preference for skilled labor and family unifications. Am I done?
Yeah, I think we have 14 minutes for questions.
Can I get 14 seconds?
Yes, you have 15 seconds.
Thank you. And further reforms in 1990 and 2000 raised immigration caps and increased the emphasis on skilled workers as advanced sectors of the economy. Extreme vetting and travel ban initiates aimed to swing the pendulum back toward the pre-civil rights era outlook. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Fels, for that. It's very important, really, information coming from different part of the world. So now I think I'm gonna use my privilege to ask the first question. Then we have two questions I saw in the chat. So all of you spoke about the immigrants and the kind of immigrants, those they come as students, F1, F2 visa, and probably overstay their visa. Some they come on J1, J2 and overstay their visa. Some they go through what we call it the lottery visa system, which the last probably 2 years was stopped or somehow put to freeze. And then you have the legal immigrants where they come for business and also to do some work in the United States. And then you have the asylee and the refugees. How you can differentiate between all these kind of immigrations and immigrants and the asylees? Was they actually are the refugees? It's, you know, they came here or they want to come here not by choice, but by different interior and exterior factors. Any one of you can speak, or all of you can speak, please, briefly.
I think the asylum seekers, they are, you know, in the Trump era, they were, for people who have temporary protected status, what we call TPS. There was a lot of challenges for them to, first of all, as you just, you know, some of us have mentioned that the quota for refugees supposedly is 125,000 before the Trump administration, and it got cut down to 15,000. Or, you know, out of those 15,000 were theoretical refugees that could be admitted, but eventually very few were admitted. So I think there's sort of two process. One is the, you know, for you know, immigrants or asylum seekers who want to come here through Central America and the Golden Triangle. You know, there was a lot of you know, debates about, you know, how do we process the asylum process? How do we provide an orderly kind of process to give them the right to seek asylum? So in the Trump administration, they just assumed that they were here and then they would be deported immediately. Or in some cases, where we have all these ideas, so that we haven't talked about the separation of families at the border and things like that. So again, this is going to be a more humane policy, but it's also, you know, because sometimes even the current administration, we still put in some of the asylum seekers into camps or some children into camps before we can figure out what to do with them. So this has been a problem for detention and deportation in our asylum process. It's a long story, so I'll just say that.
Any of the other three speakers you want to chip in, please?
I just wanted to really quickly add that I think there's also misunderstanding, and maybe in a case of Trump administration, not willingness to understand how really the refugee and asylee migration flows unfold. Usually the first people to leave, and again, this has been observed over and over in these cases, are not, you know, America envisions asylees as sort of poor people who are going to need all kinds of financial support. And this is just simply not true. When these things happen, the first people to leave are typically highly educated elites who have the resources and skin in the game to leave. By the time they get to receiving countries, they will typically establish businesses that will provide employment for less advantaged flows of migrants to follow. Unfortunately, U.S. for a long time had a policy where we would scatter refugees around United States to make them assimilate, which is complete nonsense, because if you look at Cubans, that's why Cubans were so successful. We'll let the Cuban elite settle right after Castro takes over, and then the following groups of refugees very much benefited from the infrastructure built by the first flow. So it's a misunderstanding of economic benefits of this specific flow. They're not draw down on resources that will provide resources.
Thank you, Fud. Rachel, do you want to? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the reasons of that immigration policy and that I am so problems with getting this bill passed is the immigration policy in the United States is incredibly complex. I mean, the visa system is referred to as alphabet soup. So trying to figure out your visa status, what visa you would be, trying to get people to the general public to understand, trying to get legislators to understand. There's just so many moving parts and so much misunderstanding of what goes into the system, what already exists. I mean, I'll see this all the time. I'll see someone say something, well, immigrants, you know, this shouldn't happen. I'm like, well, that's already against the law. And so this creates this is why we have a 300-page bill. And two, it's also why it makes it so hard to get change, because there are so many moving parts and so many complexities.
Thank you. I have questions to Dr. Nafari. Yeah. So, Dr. Kim, do you want to ask your question? You can unmute yourself and briefly ask questions, please.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for 3 speakers. I just learned a lot. I'm
4
just curious
speakers.
about, the numbers of the Republicans who are so committed ideologically. According to your presentation, the numbers are not that significant as much as we expected. But why are they so powerful in determining the Republican, parties' kind of agendas and policy proposals? Thank you.
Okay.
So I noted, yeah, you said the 17%. So that 17% actually applies to all Americans, and it's ideological commitment. So that is people, 17% of the American population are either consistently liberal or consistently conservative. So what the problem is Republican, but we're not, that doesn't add up to partisanship. Most Americans are intensely partisan. So there's a higher percentage of those that are partisan, which have a party identity. It's just because they identify as Republican, it doesn't mean that they're consistently conservative, or they identify as Democrat, that they're consistently liberal. So what happens is your most committed partisans are the ones that on the Republican Party are the ones that are most against immigration reform or expanding immigration. And you also have the kind of right-wing media ecosystem. You have Rush Limbaugh, you have Tucker Carlson, you have so you have this group that automatically kind of intensifies any of these things, gets the message out to these intensely partisan Republicans who are the most likely to go and vote in primaries. The people that, and of course, whoever wins the primary becomes the Republican candidate. And then you also have issues of gerrymandering in the House. Obviously, this doesn't apply in the Senate, but that's where the issue comes in. So the number of partisans isn't, or the number of people, it's not equally distributed in the population. It concentrates in this one group, and this group is the one that's most active in Republican politics.
There's a question from Luan Falls from Second Language Services. Are you there? Well, I will ask the question. Was this militarization in the 80s because of the war on drugs that's then connected and impacted and influenced the immigration? One of you can jump to answer this question, please.
There are certainly connections, but again, I referenced Jonathan Simon's work on the governance through crime. That I think he makes a pretty good argument that it's the shift in overall how governance is done from sort of a New Deal format through the 60s to much more enforcement and sort of tough on crime, tough on everything based, where we kind of treat various issues that are not criminal justice like they were a criminal justice issue. So short answer to this, there's the militarization of the border is certainly related to the war on drugs, but I would more treat them as manifestations of one larger sort of move in how America governs itself that's been going on for like 50 years now.
Thank you, Fred. There is a comment and also a question from Diana Fox. Do you want to mute yourself and elaborate briefly?
Hi, sure. Thank you, everybody. Really interesting presentations. So this is, I guess, connected to, my question is connected to maybe the forthcoming migration minor, but just sort of generally about the role of academics in bringing awareness to public and political discourse about the underlying causes of migration. Fyodor, you noted that the underlying causes need to be addressed, and during the when the Muslim ban was put into effect and with the caravan, there was in the progressive press quite a bit of discussion about the causes of migration, but rarely, in other news media. And so I'm just wondering, for those of you who focus on this issue, what your ideas are about bringing academic knowledge into wider public discourse.
Well,
Thank
some
you.
of my immigration and justice students are here would deliberately had it overlap with their class, and this is my probably fourth or fifth time teaching the seminar, and we've had that specific discussion because that's kind of the students have that question for me at the end of the class of like, well, you guys in academia know all these things. What the hell are you doing? Like, why isn't this on the news? And we sort of brainstormed different solutions. And one I actually like they came up with is perhaps we are out to introduce this information at earlier time than college. If you paid attention to one of the charts that Dr. Navarre showed, that there is very clear distinction in immigrant opinion by education. And I can very much second that. My own research with public opinion clearly shows that over the decades, one of the most consistent axes besides partisanship along which opinion lines up is education. So perhaps we're out to be talking in high schools and building this understanding of such complex issues in immigration as early as high school. But I also have to say, honestly, I think the odds are to get this information out there are so problematic in this media environment, whereas Dr. Navarre refers, right-wing media ecosystem that will chew up whatever we throw at it, that unfortunately, I'll just say it openly, that I think and I hope that this is the time for Democrats to simply strong arm this. So I would be in favor of what would be seen as extreme tactics like abolish the filibuster or pass this piecemeal through reconciliation. But at this point, I don't think we can wait for the Republicans to get on the train. You just have to adopt the ruthless tactics and drive this through no matter what happens. That's my opinion.
Thank you. The last comment and I think question from Angelo Barbosa. So I have 1 minute. You want to elaborate on yours or just you are okay?
I was just to share that information with all the colleagues.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any closing notes from our speakers? I have 1 minute. Yes, Naveed, please.
Well, I didn't get the chance to introduce my fieldwork in Turkey, but I want to share how ridiculous it is to ban refugees from Muslim countries. I worked with populations of up to 20,000 Iranians who are seeking asylum in Turkey. These are LGBTQ escaping the Islamic Republic of Iran. These are new converts to Christianity escaping the persecution of Islamic Republic of Iran. These are Baha'is and new Baha'is. These are political dissidents, activists, and journalists. For 2 years, I was working with them. And now that I'm here, after 5, 6, 7, 10 years, they are still in Turkey in transit, waiting to come to the US. Some of them were interviewed. They had the ticket in their hands, and the new administration just stopped their travel to the US. They had terminated their lease. They had sold their furniture. They were just homeless. So I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you.
I think Rachel had also something to add.
You are muted. Jabbar, you're muted.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Jabbar, I'm okay.
15 seconds each. Speakers, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess I'll close since I'm already unmuted. I was basically just going to say, unfortunately, correcting misinformation about immigrants and immigrant data doesn't always have the result we would hope it would. And it really seems to be more of a changing the narrative. If we can change how people think about immigration, that has much more of an effect than actual just being like, hey, look at the data. That doesn't do anything, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Winkai?
Again, this is the beginning of the administration, and they've got 2 years to push the more progressive agenda until the midterm election. And right now, COVID is going to be the priority for the bill. But after that, the immigration bill will be discussed in the summer or in the fall, before the summer or in the fall. So that's the time when we maybe have a follow-up discussion on that.
Thank you, Winkai. Fed, the last 15 seconds.
Nothing, okay, I'll give it to other speakers.
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for really, as someone said, excellent conversation. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for our speakers. Please help me to give them put hand, you know, you go to reaction and see the thumb up. Be safe. Remember to keep your physical distance and also the mask. And remember, we just yesterday we hit the 5 million, 500,000 people. They passed, and of course, then remember our people in Texas. Thank you so much again. Thank you for everyone participated with us in this event, and have a good day.
Professor Al Obaidi, for your moderation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much.